Welcome Year 12s to How to Write History IA Section 2, the investigation. Now this section is the real big section within the question. Remember, the question overall is worth 25 marks, 6 marks in Section A, a whopping 15 marks in this Section 2 or Section B, and then 4 marks available in Section 3 or Section C. And therefore, strategically, this is the one more than any other that you've got to get absolutely right. Of course, it's vital that each section builds on the previous one, so therefore section 1 has to be done really well because you're establishing the two main resources that you're going to use. Here we see those two main resources then being imported into what I would describe as a kind of mini essay, if not an essay, in which you're actually answering the research question that you have promoted. You're going to be answering that question by using analysis, by regularly referring to those two main interpretations, but others as well as using other supporting evidence. So this one is very much like writing a kind of challenging IB history essay, and I will talk you through it, so don't worry if you're a little bit intimidated by the thought of this. So again, I'm using a PDF, so I'm not going to be able to color highlight, but I will run the cursor kind of over what I'm talking about from the outset. Now here I've provided a suggested model, okay, and it is only a suggested model, and it's going to become clear as your IA writing ability develops that you may come up with alternative views on how to best write your IA, and it's really important that you're allowed to do that. That's part of becoming an independent learner. As I've always said to you, I'm here to provide a structure, a framework, a platform for you to thrive and develop. So don't feel funny sometimes about breaking away from this model or structure if you think that you have another structure that will serve you better. Okay. So let's start off then by looking at how we're going to structure the paragraphs in here. I mean, we're here, this is a large section. We're talking about a sizable amount of words here. Somewhere in the region of kind of 1,600 words or so, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So it is going to feel like a large essay. Just to clarify on that one, I'm just going to click on so here they're talking about 1,300 words for that, 500 in section 1, 1,300 in section 2, obviously taking us up to 1,800, with then 400 in section 3. Okay, so 1,300 words is certainly the same kind of size that you've been writing your essays in across the year. In fact, probably more than some of the essays that you've been writing. So what's going to be in the first paragraph? My suggestion is that you start off by introducing your question. And what do I mean by that? Outlining the controversy or debate relating to your IA research question. So for example, Hitler officially became undisputed leader of the Nazi Party after 1933, but this did not eradicate his reliance on his subordinates and their ability to enact his will. So in other words, if the research question is getting you to support or challenge that view, then clearly the most important thing straight away is that there is a controversy here. There is this idea of Hitler, the strong leader, the Führer, in many ways an orthodox view, particularly in the early years of Nazi history. And then by the 1980s, 90s, there was a view that perhaps Hitler had been a little bit more in the background than earlier historians had accepted or believed, and that actually he had a number of very strong ministers who were allowed to rule their ministries almost like mini kings, and in many ways they didn't check everything with Hitler. They interpreted what was called Hitler's will, and made decisions based on what they thought Hitler would be happy to see and hear going on. And that in many ways Hitler was a very lazy leader who spent a lot of time chilling out while his ministers did the hard work. So clearly, as coming back to this, therefore, there is a controversy, I think you'd agree, over this kind of question area, and it's really important that all of your research questions have controversy. Otherwise, they're really a non-starter, and I'm going to have to send you back to the really the sort of drawing board if I come across a question that just doesn't have this controversy in it. So as I said already, the debate arises out of this question of whether Hitler was a strong leader or not, whether Hitler was an involved central to the rule of the Nazis or not. Now, obviously, as part of that in paragraph 1, if you were doing that question, you would need to introduce and outline the different interpretation and perspectives on this question. And it would also be very important for you to be able to name historians. Okay, it's not really good enough to say some historians say, or there are some historians who think. You really must be able to quote historians directly. So I've got an example here for you. So the historiography of this area is caricaturized by the debate between intentionalists who say that Hitler exploited confusion in government to sustain his power and control, whereas there are structuralists like Peterson, so I'm explicitly naming a historian, who in fact argue that Hitler had limited powers caused by the rigorous actions and roles of his government ministries, who were really rapidly and aggressively competing with each other. These are referred to as the old and new ministries. So for example, if you consider that there was already a ministry for economics before the Nazi period, Hitler comes in and he creates a brand new Nazi ministry for the economy, first of all led by Hjalmar Schacht, and later on he then creates a 4-year plan ministry. So another ministry comes in, and it's really important to kind of show this to the examiner to show the depth of your knowledge. There's also another view, which is a kind of combination of the two. A third view is a synthesis of intentionalism, but also structuralism, and somebody like Professor Sir Ian Kershaw follows this, claiming that in many ways the ministers of Hitler worked to his will, what they thought he wanted, and that he didn't always dictate decision making. However, Kershaw also accepts that at key moments Hitler was very much in charge, and we see this more evidently and explicitly when war breaks out and Hitler taking real kind of control over his generals as things begin to get worse for the Nazis after the failure at Stalingrad. So that's really what you're looking at in your first paragraph. So in the opening paragraph, looking to establish the research question, establish the context around it, and to establish the debate, proving that there is a debate surrounding the question that you have chosen. Moving on then into your next paragraph, it would be very impressive if you were to lead each paragraph either by factor or theme. Obviously theme, things like social, political, economic. Factor, more specific labels, so it could be something like in terms of the origins of World War I, slide to war, failure of diplomacy, rather than just saying political, because political's quite broad and vague. So political would be a typical thematic heading. Slide to war or sleepwalking, referring to Professor Clark's work, would be clearly a kind of factor label. What you must avoid in this section is a section 2 which is kind of chronologically driven. In other words, you're just following the dates through from the oldest point of the area that you're studying to the youngest. That would be a huge mistake and very limiting in terms of the final mark that you will receive in this heavy mark section. If you can get this section right, you're going a long way towards getting a very high grade. And it's very interesting. I've just looked at the IA scores for the year above you, and we've got this amazing collection of 6s and 7s because the students followed the structures that I'm providing for you now. They didn't have the videos, but they did have these files which they used a lot. So getting into this second paragraph, leading with, I would argue, the kind of leading factor, theme, or interpretation. If you think about it, you've already identified 2 leading interpretations in section 1, so logically you could push that through into section 2 and lead with those. Those interpretations are very much often supported by a key individual historian, sometimes by a school of historians like functionalism or structuralism for the Nazis, or intentionalism for the Nazis, or if you're studying the Bolshevik period, you might be looking at the Marxist view. So you're not just looking at one historian, but a collection of historians, and you must still name some individual ones to be very specific whenever you can. So lead by factor, theme, or interpretation, almost like the school of history that you are kind of examining and how it differs to another school. As I've said already, provide the historians' names if you can. Perhaps use a quote, evidence, or stats to support their claims. Now, it's really important in these paragraphs in section 2 that you scaffold on the opening argument made by this interpretation group. So in other words, if you start off by saying something like, the structuralists believe that Hitler had been opportunistic in his foreign policy, you then need to scaffold that with a specific historian. So then if you're able to say something like A.J.P. Taylor, if A.J.P. Taylor's the one providing the opportunistic thing on that, you could say A.J.P. Taylor suggested that Hitler was never more than a few days or weeks in making his calculations for foreign policy, that these things were reactions to short-term shifts in international relations. That's great, because you've then piggybacked Taylor onto the opening interpretation, and that's being specific, and that's going to work very well. Here, for example, is a good one. Although Kershaw recognizes that measures such as those taken towards the Holocaust were enacted by lower-ranking officials without the authority of Hitler, he also recognizes that much of Hitler's power came from the way other people in government and the German people perceived him, not solely on his ability as a dictator, but in the form of charismatic rule. Okay, so in other words, you can see there that Kershaw's mentioned, that there's a specific reference to the Kershaw perspective. It goes on to say Hitler, in Kershaw's view, was indeed above party politics, and he ruthlessly pursued objectives which were clarified by those below him. He nevertheless was structurally conditioned to support successes on which his charisma, power surrounding his charisma, rested. This helps us to explain the level of Hitler's control he was able to exercise, despite the fact that he was very often unable to directly control all elements of government. You'll also notice in that example that I have been citing there, the footnote numbers are there, 12 and 13, and it would be an expectation really that you would be able to produce something like between 8 to 15 citations while you're writing section 2. It's really, really important that there are plenty of citations that are arisen out of your research. The research documents will be listed in your bibliography, but it's really and really important that you show the range of research materials relevant to your question that you found within this section. If you don't get them into this section, you are going to seriously limit your mark, and it's going to be a terrible waste of your research phase. Get those different interpretations, sometimes disagreeing, what we call counter-argument, sometimes supporting the previous one, what we call scaffolding. Get them in and use them. Don't just concentrate on the one person. So if your interpretation one is very much about one historian, well, you're going to have to counter that on that point, on that factor, counter-argue that, or see if you can come up with a scaffolding point from somebody else, even if you actually, in a very narrowly researched area, have to scaffold or counter-argue from the same historian from a different part of that work, or from a book that was written a few years later. So there's some tips and clues on how you can do that. As you then move to paragraph 3, you're then moving on to look at a second factor, theme, or interpretation. Again, we would expect those two interpretations, the one from the previous paragraph and the one from this one, to have one of those two historians or historical sources that you refer to in section A. They've got to be really visible and explicit, but as I've just said, also be using others within these as well. As we've said above, Therefore, make sure that the historian's name is included, that you get to a point of specific counter-argument or piggybacking where you're actually naming the historian that is supporting or disagreeing with the previous point. If you've got evidence and statistics, that's obviously fantastic. So it's really what I've said on the previous paragraph, done again in paragraph 3, but on a different theme, factor, or interpretation. You can also apply the same to your fourth paragraph. Now, in your fourth paragraph, as I've said here, ideally you want to be analysing a third interpretation, one that is beyond what was referred to in section A, where you were asked to refer to 2 specific historical works. Very often these questions will have a third interpretation. Give you an example. Areas like the study of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik Russia, the Nazi period, fascist Italy, origins of World War I will very often have 3 or 4 different interpretations, causal factors, for example. And therefore it's really important to show the examiner that you have an understanding of the wider scope of the question that you're looking at, and this is where you bring in that third one. So for example, if you were doing the origins of World War I, so you start off by perhaps in the first paragraph referring to nationalism, argument, counter-argument, historians, etc. In the second paragraph you refer to the alliance system, arguments, counter-arguments, etc. In the third paragraph you might want to refer to the slide to war, sleepwalking in to World War I, this idea of the failure of the diplomats around Europe in those weeks prior to the outbreak of World War I. That would be absolutely perfect, and you want to be as much as possible critically analysing the different interpretations within each paragraph factor, but at times you can actually work across the paragraphs to kind of critically counter-argue or indeed critically scaffold as well. You know, it could be, and I know this for a fact, that the slide to war theory has quite a significant crossover with the alliance system, because if you think about it, the slide to war in essence is a failure of the alliance system, certainly a kind of broader failure of diplomacy. The alliance system, remember, was indeed just seen at the time as a kind of evolution of the realpolitik Congress style, where all the European powers would get together to try and keep a kind of balance of power in Europe. And they thought that the alliance system would be able to manage this with the assertive rise of the German Empire, for example, and how someone like France felt about that. So do make sure that you do that well. By the time we get to paragraph 5, we're then looking at creating a conclusion or a final judgment on these interpretations. So you're kind of revisiting your research question, you're discussing the relative merit of each of these interpretations by vigorously examining them against other interpretations. All the time with explicit reference to the research question. I cannot state enough the importance of frequent linkage back to your research question all the way through this essay. It's good essay practice for your essays in general. It's vital in this IA section 2 as well. And please avoid directly repeating what you've already said in previous paragraphs. That is a bit of a habit, something that happens quite a lot in these kind of situations. So what are the kind of, I've just tried to finish off here with a top grade mark scheme requirements checklist. So number 1, for section 2, make sure your investigation is clear, coherent and effectively organised. Secondly, make sure your investigation contains well-developed critical analysis, focus clearly on the stated question, the research question. Make sure there's a range of sources and references used effectively to support the argument, somewhere between 8 to 15 in section 2. And finally, make sure that there's a detailed evaluation of the different perspectives. Investigation argues to a reasoned conclusion must be considered with arguments and evidence provided. And I think that sums up all the key things. Remember, this section 2 is a fusion of differing interpretations that needs to come across. It's a critical analysis of all the key kind of interpretations that you've been looking at. Please do not pick an IA question which is the same if you're doing a history extended essay as your history extended essay, because that will not be accepted by the board. and remember to have lots of change, continuity, causation, consequence, significance and perspectives in your work. So thank you very much.